Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. In this lecture we're going to explore identity access management and in particular roles, and we're going to create an EC2 instance that has been assigned a role and we're going to use that role to communicate to S3. So in the last lab we configured the AWS command line interface and we're actually storing the credentials locally on that EC2 instance. Now I made the comment that imagine if that EC2 instance was compromised and somebody was able to get at those credentials, they would then be able to access your AWS environment using those credentials from anywhere in the world. So it is a security risk storing your credentials locally on an EC2 instance. The other issue is it can be hard to manage. So if you go through and reset that user's credentials, you would then have to log into each EC2 instance that you're running and update those new credentials. So it can be a bit of a nightmare, and that's why Amazon released this new roles functionality of IAM, and it can be a very popular exam topic. So to continue with this lab, you'll need to log into the AWS console. Okay, so the first thing I want you to do is go in and click on Identity Access Management. And under IAM, if you look off to the left-hand side, you'll see roles. Now, if you click on that, you might actually see two roles. And this was a role that was created when we set up cross-region replication. And this is the role that we created in the Identity and Access Management lab. So if you don't already have this role, you can go back to the Identity Access Management lab and see how we created it. Or really quickly, you can just hit Create New Role, call it something like S3, go ahead and select the service role for EC2 because EC2 is going to be using this role, and then just select on the policy Amazon S3 full access and you hit create role and that will create the role. So once you've got this role, I want you to go back over to the main console and go into EC2, and then I want you to click on launch instance. And so we're going to launch a new instance. We're going to use the Amazon Linux AMI, going to use a T2 micro. And we're going to go ahead and select the role down here. So S3 admin access. I want you to leave everything else as it is and just go next, next, and we'll call this my EC2 role server. Go ahead and hit next and select your DMZ security group and hit review and launch, and then launch the EC2 instance using your default key pair. So that is now launching the instance, and if we go in and have a look at the instances, you'll actually be able to see the role down here. So IAM role S3 admin access. And so that's a fundamental part of what you need to know for the exam, is that an IAM role can only be assigned as and when a EC2 instance is being launched. You can't assign a role after an EC2 instance has been launched. Now what we can do is go in and change the policy document behind this role. So we can actually go in and change the permissions, but that's not the same thing as changing the role itself. So just bear that in mind when you are going into the exam. You can only assign a role to an EC2 instance as and when you're launching it. Yes, you can change the permissions behind a role for existing EC2 instances, and those permissions will take effect immediately, but you cannot assign a new role to an EC2 instance, an existing EC2 instance. You need to go in and do it when you're launching it. So I'm just going to pause the video here and wait for this EC2 instance to come back up. Okay, so that EC2 instance is now available, and I'm just going to get the public IP address here, cut and paste it into my browser, and I'm going to go ahead and launch my terminal window. Okay, so I'm in my terminal window and I'm going to SSH into my EC2 instance. So I do that by typing SSH EC2-user at the public IP address, then -i, and then the name of my key, which is my EC2 key.pem. I'm going to hit yes, and there we go. So I've logged into it. I'm going to elevate my privileges, and I'm going to clear the screen. And so the big test is now, will I be able to browse the contents of my S3 environment? So AWS S3 ls is the command I want to run. And you can see straight away it's used the role to access S3, and I'm able to view the contents of my buckets within S3. Now if I go over to my home directory and I type in ls-a to show all hidden files, you'll be able to see here that there's no .aws. So credentials are not being stored in this, in this environment. It is just using a role. So this makes it a lot more secure. It means that my applications that are being hosted on this web server would be able to call, the functionality of S3, and I wouldn't have to worry about maintaining those credentials locally on my EC2 instance. And then if they go ahead and update, or if I go ahead and change my credentials, I don't have to log into the EC2 instances manually and update them all. Okay, so that's almost it for this lab, guys. There's 4 things I need you to take away from this lab going into the exam. The first is that roles are generally considered to be more secure than storing your access key and secret access key on individual EC2 instances. And the reason for that is that, if your EC2 instance is compromised, that hacker could only use the contents of your S3 buckets via that EC2 instance. So you could just go in and terminate that individual EC2 instance, and then they wouldn't be able to access S3. However, if they stole your access key and your secret access key, they would be able to access S3 from anywhere in the world, and you might not even be aware of it. The only way to stop them in that scenario would be to delete the access key and the secret access key and then re-provision the credentials with new ones. You'd then have to go in and update your EC2 instances with those new credentials, which brings me on to the second point. Roles are much easier to manage. You assign a role to an EC2 instance. You can then go in and change the permissions of that role afterwards, but it's you're not having to worry about managing access keys and secret access key and who's got access to what. So roles are much easier to manage. The third one is that roles can only be assigned when that EC2 instance is being provisioned. So that's really important. You can change the permissions or the policy of a role after it has been assigned to an EC2 instance, but what you can't do is change roles on an EC2 instance or take an existing EC2 instance and assign a new role to it. You have to assign that role when you're first creating that EC2 instance. And the fourth one is something I haven't actually covered yet in the lab, but it's really important to remember this as a general principle going into the exam. Basically, roles are universal, so you can use them in any region. So I could go into South Korea, or I could go into the Tokyo region, or I could go into the Sydney region and go into EC2. And when I go to provision an EC2 role, you would be able to see that S3 role in there. So roles are universal, and you can use them in any region. You don't have to worry about creating individual roles on a per region basis. So that's it for this lecture, guys. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the next lecture. Thank you.